Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another book review on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and the book we are taking a look at today is the Winchester Model 1895, Last of the Classic Lever Actions by Kassab and Brad Dunbar. I actually had the pleasure of meeting both of the authors at a gun show just recently, and they're some very cool people and totally passionate about this subject. And frankly, I think they've put together a really excellent book. So one of the things that makes the Winchester 1895 a little different than the sort of guns that I usually look at myself is the fact that this is a commercial firearm. Actually, it's interesting that it is, by virtue of numbers sold, primarily a military firearm. However, the vast majority of its collectability and history is in the commercial versions. So the 1895 was introduced as a sporting rifle in a variety of different configurations, carbines, muskets, sporting rifles, long rifles, short rifles, carbines, you name it, a huge multiplicity of different options and configurations. Now, Winchester was always trying to make military sales of the gun, and they made a couple. They sold 10,000 to the US military, and that ended up really going nowhere. And then they sold 293,000 of them, which is more than half of the overall production, to the Russian government between 1915 and 1917. The Russians bought these things in 7.62 by 54 rimmed as a supplement to their Mosin-Nagant rifles. They desperately needed firearms during World War I. Winchester had this production line up and running, and presto, like 60% of the sales went to Russia. So the question arises to me of how do you make the best book about this sort of rifle? There's so many nuances and variations that when you put them together, you can get almost an infinite number of different looking Winchester 1895s. Well, what Rob and Brad did is they kind of covered every aspect of the gun. So the book begins with a discussion of where the design came from. It talks about Browning, whose patent is the basis for the gun. It talks about Winchester. It talks about guys like Mason, who was one of Winchester's in-house design engineers, and it was his responsibility to take a patent from Browning and turn it into something that Winchester could actually market and sell. So all the personalities involved. These guys did a bunch of research at the Cody Firearms Museum and the McCracken Research Library, so they have a ton of original documentation that they've reproduced. And because that museum houses the Winchester Firearms Collection, they actually had access to a bunch of Winchester's prototypes. And there's like 8 different prototype 1895s manufactured by hand by John Moses Browning that are in the museum that are pictured here in the book to give you some idea of what else were they looking at? Because a lot of these are ideas like a Mannlicher packet or an en bloc style clip loading Winchester 1895. Browning built one, didn't end up going into production. So a lot of that stuff is covered at the beginning. And then there's discussion of the gun itself, so the different elements. And that's really the way you do this, is you break it up by what are the elements of the receivers, what are the elements of the barrels, what are the elements of the sights. And there's a huge variety, and they cover each one, and where you find different elements, which style of sights were used on which patterns of the rifles, and enough detail. And by the way, this whole book is absolutely chock full of really good pictures. The photography is quite good. But enough detail, you can determine things like, is this an aftermarket sight? Is this a real, an original sight? And then there's also a bunch of discussion of sort of the historiography. What are Winchester's records? At what points did Winchester go from, on the one hand, when did they go from things like serial number ledgers to serial number cards? And what are the implications of this for the collector? But then on the other hand, also, when did Winchester start even caring about its own history? When did they start doing factory letters? When did they have their own company museum? As opposed to the days when excess records were taking up too much space, so they took them into the basement and threw them into the power plant and burned them as fuel for the company power plant. They discuss all of this sort of history that for a Winchester 1895 owner, I think is really interesting. And in fact, it goes beyond just the 1895. So a lot of this sort of information is equally applicable to a lot of the other guns Winchester was making at the time. For example, 1892 and 1894 carbines. They don't specifically address those at all in here. However, Winchester's record keeping was the same. A lot of Winchester's elements, like the sights that they used on those rifles were often the same as on the 1895. The styles of engraving, the styles of wood. What was fancy grade Winchester wood? Because this is a day you can't, when they're selling these things, you can't go on the internet and look at pictures. They had a catalog, and the catalog would say things like you can get fancy and extra fancy and grade 1, 2, 3, 4. What do those things mean? Well, they explain in here what they mean for the 1895, but that explanation extends to a lot of Winchester's other guns. So I think this book obviously is focused on the 1895 and will be of most interest to people who want more information on that rifle, but it will also definitely be of significant use to people who are interested in any of Winchester's other products around this time period. Now, continuing on from that, because this is a fairly thick book, there are a couple specific contextual sections at the end. So they talk about the Winchester 1895 in Mexico. It had substantial use during a lot of the unrest in Mexico around this time period. There's a chapter about the 1895 in Russian military service. That one's actually written by Mike Carrick, who's been on this show before. And that chapter has a bunch of great information, including some really cool pictures that I'd never seen before of the 1895 in Russian military service, especially in Latvian military service. So after that section on shorter section, but some of the other places and groups that the 1895 had significant use with. So there's talk about its competition against the Savage 99 for New York State militia use. There's talk about its use by the Texas Rangers and by the Arizona Rangers. This really is chock full of cool information, tons of pictures. There are a lot of places in the book where there are pictures of a bunch of varieties of something, a bunch of different receiver styles or different barrel styles or different barrel lengths, all compared, side by side and easily compared and contrasted and understood. Really, this may sound a bit effusive, but I really like the layout of the book. I like the style of the book. It looks good. It's interesting. It's got a lot of information in it. It really is an excellent book. If you're interested in the Winchester 1895, you will definitely appreciate getting a copy of this. And to put the cherry on top, they actually looked at the price and went, wow, most of the time a book like this would be like $150, but we don't know that that would sell very well and we want to sell more of them. So they priced this at $80. You can pick it up directly from them through their website, or you can get it on Amazon. I'll include links to both of those in the description text below. When I talked to them, they'd pre-sold, because it was just coming out, about a third of the print run. So I suspect this one's actually going to go fairly fast. I think it's a book that looks great. It's a book with a lot of useful information in it, and it's a book that is remarkably reasonably priced. And you put those together, and that says pretty soon it'll be sold out. So if you're interested in the 1895 or in Winchester rifles of the period, definitely pick up a copy. And thanks for watching.